I've been calling him skinless data. The two reasons, obviously, was his obvious inaccuracy to anything that appeared on screen, but also an idea that he would be too scary for kids. That they had come up with something rather ghoulish, And if you look at the sculpt, it's intense. He's fully, he's nude and he looks like a Terminator.
Hi, my name is James Patrik. I'm a writer and an archivist. I'm a collector and lover of Star Trek, and I'm currently working on a YouTube documentary on the history of the Star Trek Playmates line.
Hi, I'm Scott Holznagel, pro wrestler and Star Trek toy collector, and you're listening to Trek Untold.
Welcome back to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know too many Star Trek fans who don't own any merchandise from its many iterations. For me, I've always been a toy collector, not just of this franchise, but plenty of others. But really, it was the Star Trek toys as a kid that helped me fall deeper into the world of the Next Generation, which was my first Trek. And decades later, it was the action figures that revived my interest in the franchise. Today, I have a massive collection of Star Trek figures, and an extremely high percent of that collection is courtesy of Playmates toys. They're the folks who took over making Trek toys in the 90s after Galoob dropped the ball with their figures during Season 1 of the Next Generation. And over the course of many years, Playmates produced countless characters and changed the way adults collected action figures. To kind of frame this up here, keep in mind when Playmates was doing the Star Trek toys, this was the beginning of the limited edition comic books and collectibles era, a boom period where everybody was starting to cash in on the nerd market with the illusion of exclusivity. Something that ultimately really led to the demise of the Playmates Star Trek line. Fast forward today, many years later from the 90s, and Playmates is now at last back in control of Star Trek toys, making them for a whole new generation, but not nearly as prolific as they once were. Today on Trek Untold, I'm speaking with two toy collectors whose knowledge of Playmates Star Trek toys far outweighs mine, and so too do their collections. We're joined by Scott Holznagel, collector and customizer extraordinaire, as well as Star Trek toy archivist James Patrik, to discuss some of the hits and misses of Playmates during their 90s run, along with a lot of discussion centered around some of the unproduced toys that never got made. It's time to get deep and nerdy with these two toy collectors, as today we're digging deep into the strange rise and fall and also what never was with Playmates Star Trek action figures. But before we get into this week's episode, I have to ask you, are you following Trek Untold on social media yet? You can find us over on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Trek Untold, one word with no spaces. You can also become a Patreon supporter for this podcast over at patreon.com/TrekUntold. Here, you can directly contribute to keeping this show running at full power for as low as a few bucks a month. If you do this, you'll have early access to new episodes, the ability to ask future guests questions, check out exclusive merchandise, and other special benefits. We've also got an official merch store and an Amazon store filled with Star Trek goodies, so if you want to rock a Trek Untold t-shirt to the next con you're going to, or order something Star Trek related for yourself or someone else, please use the links in the show notes to help us help you. Shout out to our show sponsor, Triple Fiction Productions, makers of fine 3D printed Star Trek inspired toys and accessories for collectors of all kinds. But you'll hear more about them later on. Now without further ado, let's beam up this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. And welcome back to Trek Untold, and now joining us on multiple sides of the screen, we're about to engage in an epic conversation about action figures, one that I feel like has been years in the making with both of these gentlemen. I'm very excited to have them on the show today. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves to you right now.
My name's Scott Holznagel, longtime Trek fan, professional wrestler, tech nerd, and ridiculous collection of Star Trek merchandise.
Hi, I'm James Patrik, writer, Australian, Huge Trek fan, especially the Playmates Star Trek line. Huge collector of all of the figures, and currently working on an independent documentary series on the Playmates action figure line.
Well, thank you guys for being here with me today. You know, I'm a serious Star Trek toy collector. I've seen you guys in all the Facebook groups for quite some time, and I've never really interacted with you guys too much. I mean, James, you and I have had like a few Facebook combos here and there.
Yeah.
Scott, I've seen you a few times here and there as well, but like outside of it. So, you know, it's cool to actually converse with you guys and talk about one of the greatest toy lines of all time, even if it's ultimately one of the most worthless toy lines of all time. And we'll get into that as we go along here. But gentlemen, I kind of want to start things off here by asking a variation of the usual question I start these episodes with. And that's going to be, what's your earliest memory of Star Trek? But also, what's your earliest memory of Star Trek toys? I'm going to start this with you, James, because you're down under. And I'm very curious to see what the Australian answer is going to be to this one.
The Australian experience of Star Trek is many years delayed compared to the United States. So Next Generation debuted in 1991 over here. And so my memory is really seeing the undiscovered country in the cinemas with my parents, who dragged me along. And I had no idea what the premise was. And all my parents told me was, this is the last one. This is the last one. And I just... I remember being 7 years old and I didn't understand it. Why is this the last one? And we got Encounter at Farpoint in 1991, when I think the show was in its fifth I remember the press was talking about unification and none of it made sense. And so we would see the uniforms and things like that wouldn't really make sense to us because we're still watching season one. So very blurry memories of early season one Next Generation on VHS, really, and just renting that season of Next Gen on tape, on VHS tape constantly. So I know season one of Next Gen really well.
And how about the world of toys? When did that come into play for you?
At a convention, I met Majel Barrett at a convention here in a hotel that no longer exists, and I was so excited. This has been embarrassing. I was so excited, like Kenny Star. I threw up on a Klingon cosplayer. Majel Barrett took such pity on me, and brought me to the top of the line so that I could get my autograph. And I got a Riker action figure with the rips on the torso, and that was my very first Star Trek toy. And I remember, just prior to the internet, I just staring at that card back, just constantly in my bedroom, just imagining the other figures, because they were not easily available here. And so just imagining what they'd be like. Just constantly obsessing over that card back and every little detail.
And Scott, how about you? What's your earliest memory of Star Trek, and how did you find your way into the world of Star Trek toys?
I think probably the first memory I have is Star Trek The Next Generation came on at some point after a show that I was already watching, and I think it was probably right in the middle of the third season. So I hadn't seen either of the previous seasons, and I really wasn't interested in Star Trek. I love sci-fi, and I had watched all the Star Wars movies, and that had kind of died down, and they didn't have any other media in that direction by that point. And so I fell into the episode, and there's something about the opening that I was like, wow, this is really different. Like, there's this big, orchestral, and the ship is flying around, and, so I stuck around with it. And then, after seeing a couple of episodes, I was hooked, and I was watching it all the time. Which of course then led me to wanting the toys, because I was a kid, I wanted toys. You watch some show you like, you want the toys. And I remember being in a KV Toys, and they had the Galoob figures. And I kept thinking, well, I'm going to get him one of these days. I'm going to get him one of these days. And, I kept putting it off because there were other toys that I wanted. And then at some point they were gone, and I was kicking myself because I was like, man, I could have got them. They were on like clearance. I probably could have got almost every one of them. And then they announced the Playmates line, and I was incredibly stoked.
On that note, too, how did you then start collecting again as an adult? Like, were you consistently collecting, Scott, from like that moment on until forever and ever, or was there kind of like a break and something got you back into it?
Pretty much collecting from then. I was, anytime there was even a toy store remotely near where I might be, I was checking it for figures, because back then, the waves came out and you didn't necessarily get everything, and there wasn't a ton of retailers. If we were in some shopping plaza and they had a KB or a Toy Works, I was going in to see if they had a Troy, which was one that I chased forever in the lilac jumpsuit. And so I still had all of those figures and was collecting pretty much through the Deep Space Nine initial releases, and then some of the stuff after that. But I had a lot of holes beyond that point. So once I got back into collecting as an adult, that's when I started filling those holes and trying to get I'm not a completist in most sense in everything I collect. So I don't have every figure they've ever released. I have the ones that I want, which 4.5 to 5. I have pretty much all of those, but there's some other figures that I'm not that interested in.
Now, James, as we've already mentioned, you're over on the other side of the world. You're in Australia. I feel like things were going to be a lot harder for you. I mean, as far as like international stuff goes, I know Germany got some things, and that was through Bandai, but like, how did you get stuff? And again, I'm looking at what's behind you right now, and like, you got some good stuff there. So how did you start collecting as an adult?
Well, as an adult, I think it's the very stereotypical idea of having these toys as a kid and not having the money or the ability to get them, and then suddenly becoming an adult and thinking, now I've got all this disposable income, I'm going to have every one of them. And unlike you, Scott, I think against my better judgment, I do have every one of them. And so I can tell you that they're not all winners. Some of them are not fantastic, but by and large, they're always really wonderfully made, and they're always really wonderfully detailed. And I think really around sort of 2012, 2013 was really the point at which I sort of thought I had a collection already, but it's really time to plug every single one of those gaps. So I want all of them, just to see what it's like to have every single one of them and fulfill that childhood ambition, I think, that had been nestling inside me since I was 9 years old, I think. Incidentally, I worked at a collectible store as well at that time.
That helps.
Which it did. We got a lot of collections in. And I think really just by absorption, you're around this stuff all day, and you just think, my God, this is amazing. It was a really lovely, memorable few years.
Now, on top of that, too, you said you're a completionist. That's with the figures, but I think beyond that, you're also kind of a completionist in the world of archiving, because you have a great blog, which is upcloseandplastic.blogspot.com. We're going to have links to it in the show notes. It's a wonderful resource of a lot of great information, like really, really good stuff there. And you've been essentially archiving like any print information out there, whether it's advertisements or Toy Fair catalogs about the Star Trek toys here. So talk to me a little bit about that and why you decided to start like saving those things and hold on to them.
Mostly because I thought that they would be easily available, and they're not. And they're really connected to the work in a collectible store, in that I found one day just these boxes and boxes of Tomart's magazines and action figure guide, Lee's action figure guide, and I'd never really seen any of that stuff. And so really, to the owner of the collectible store, they were worthless, and he was like, "Go and take them home." And so I would come home with these big stacks of magazines and flip through them. And some of the stuff that I found was jaw-dropping to me. Some of the old, because this was how Playmates used to communicate with their fan base about upcoming figures, or they'd show off their wares at the toy fairs of the day. And I just assumed that the internet was a much deeper resource than it actually is. And so having these resources and a scanner, I just sort of put them out there. And I've seen these images everywhere now. I've seen them used all over the place. And I'm very happy for people to please take them and download them and save them. And on top of that, people have been really, a lot of fans have been really generous Martin in Germany has been scanning some of the Playmates industry catalogs and then sending me these huge collections that I've now been able to share with the fan community. And I have some show and tell actually. So I would find stuff like this in our store, which is I've just cut this out of the magazine, and this is how they announced the Voyager line of figures, which is crazy. It would just be you'd have extensive coverage of Comic-Con or something like that, and I would find this is Toy Fair 1995, and to see early prototypes, and you can get to see all of the original prototypes that they advertised. The Admiral Riker is actually a lot different. The sculpt is totally different. There was a 3-inch chromium line, which were really, really tiny. Figures that got announced and never happened. And so a lot of these details are sort of just lost to history. So researching this is almost like its own form of archaeology. Fans have been very helpful. The Wayback Machine has been really helpful. But even so, I mean, I feel like I've only really scratched the surface, and so much has really been lost, and I've had so many discussions on Facebook about prototypes and things that we've seen, the Galore class Cardassian ship. Like, where is that? Who has that? Someone has to have that. You hope.
You would hope. Funny thing is, I've actually kind of asked about that in the past with some of the other folks I've talked to about this, and they've kind of felt like most of those sort of things, like the role-playing items for the most part, and a lot of the ships especially, were probably tooled overseas completely. So like they're probably either somewhere in someone's store, they have no idea what they are, or they were just tossed in the garbage because no one cared. So it's really crazy to think about that.
Yeah. It's before I think maybe a theory that I've heard is that maybe it's prior to this idea that people identified them as something valuable, and so a lot of them were just thrown away.
Yeah, I mean, most of that stuff was really not meant to be kept in at all. Like, it was really supposed to be internal purposes only, and that was it. Never see the light of day at all.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking now to sort of. I mean, once in a while, like we've talked about, the three of us, you'll see these prototypes come up for sale, but it feels like a drip feed. It really does. And even when Varna Studios has a display, or Scott Henze, the sculptor, even the resources he has are quite limited.
And I got to mention too, I love those Toy Fair catalogs you were just talking about a little bit earlier. Like, those are a serious wealth of just unproduced toys. And we're going to talk about some of those today, some of the ones you've already mentioned, in fact, as we get into things here. But I want to take it back to prototypes for a second, Scott, because you and I are proto collectors. One of these days, I promise I will get around to actually showing my collection on camera in depth. It's a lot of stuff, and I got to really sort through it. But I know you're big on this as well. So I'd love if you can kind of tell us a little bit about your proto collection. And if you don't mind, help break down some of the terminology. We've talked about it on the show before with some of the folks who made these toys, but for collectors out there who really don't know what they're looking at, I'd love it if you can kind of break down some of the terminology that we see out there and how to actually tell what's proto versus just non-production. And I say this as a caveat because you and I can all go check on eBay right now. We're going to see like a ton of quote unquote unproduced Funko Pop prototypes when really they're not prototypes at all. So Scott, tell us all about this proto side of things.
Sure. So during the 90s, and really prior to, maybe the last 15 years, that might be, stretching it a little, toys were made by sculptors. They sculpted them. They, came up with an idea. Sometimes it was off of a number of drawings and schematics, and then they sat down and they sculpted the whole toy. And so that usually occurred in sometimes clay, sometimes that would also be done in wax. And those occasionally actually make it out there, and they're probably some of the more fragile prototypes. Once that happens, and they get a design they like, maybe even working on some of where the articulation will go, then those would end up being cast in wax or in resin. Usually resin is the second half of that. Resin prototypes are usually the more common ones. You see them quite often. A lot of times there are things which are essentially unpainted throwaway stuff at production that people will try to say are prototypes and made of resin, but they're usually just made of plastic. And they're not actually prototypes. From there, you might get a paint master, which could be resin and usually is. Paint masters are how they get some reference for what the paint should look like, and usually a way for them to develop a schema that will let them know what the paint should be, what what shades they should be using, where they'll be applied, and that's given to the factory so that they know what to do. Paint masters are probably one of the more sought after prototypes because they're the most complete looking ones. They are fully painted. They're usually really pretty and meticulously detailed. Usually they have a lot of details that don't actually make it into production. And then once you get to that point, either you'll see some people sell or refer to hard copies, test shots, things like that. Those are usually what you see when you're talking about the Funko Pops that people sell. They're not really prototypes. They're probably just test shots where they ran this through the molding. It came out. It looks like it's supposed to. And then those would normally get thrown away. But of course, nowadays, people know that somebody might buy them, which they do. Especially if they're an unproduced figure, which is makes it worthwhile to own if you want unproduced figures. I actually only collect unproduced prototypes. There are a couple things I have non-Trek that are prototypes of production figures, but as far as Trek goes, I really only collect unproduced.
You can't just tease us like that, Scott. You gotta tell us what you got in your collection now. Like now we're all like really curious.
Well, I went ahead and grabbed them for some show and tell as well.
How convenient.
Like
we planned this.
Look at that. Geez, it's almost like I had an idea and we talked about it. So the first thing that I'll show is I actually have the paint master for the unproduced Con 12-inch figure. And so essentially this is the final piece of production before this would be sent off and then they would produce it. And so that is the Con head. And you can see once it focuses correctly that it is fully painted. This is going to be made of resin, so you can kind of tell that there's some resin residue there. This is actually a super nice piece. I mean, it's really, really well painted. Obviously, they nailed it on the sculpts. I mean, this looks exactly like Ricardo Montalban. Hair looks great. They never produced the body out of any ordinary. Like it's just the same sculpt for the body for almost all of the 12-inch figures. That's why they're all the same size. But they did produce clothing. I unfortunately do not have the remainder of the prototype. I have a body that is just a custom body for it to sit on, but the head is the most interesting part because it's obviously really quite nice. It's a shame they didn't make it. That would have been a really cool figure. It's probably one of the big misses on the 12-inch side of things.
Yeah. Do you think that's Steve Varner?
I believe Varner did. Yeah, I believe Varner did the 12-inch heads. So it's likely his work. This actually is Scott Henze. This next one up. This would have been from the Alien series that they did. So you have the ones with actions. This doesn't have an action in the back because they hadn't worked out the mechanism. But it's a Klingon, just a general Klingon. Doesn't have any distinctive character marks, but sculpt on this is super nice. Let's see if I can maybe get a little closer with some focus. Not super great, but you can kind of tell how nice looking this piece is. And this is in the full scale that it would have been. So this is cast resin. It does have some posability, but don't like to mess around with it too much because it is stuck together with pins. But another really good looking one. This would have been great. I don't have any idea why they didn't produce this. It would have been a great figure. And then lastly, this is kind of a cheat because I did say that I only collect unreleased figures. Technically, this was released because, and we'll probably talk more about this here in a minute, but this is Brunt. This is in the scale with the rest of the line. At first glance, it appears to be an unreleased Brunt figure. In reality, this is a 3-up. It was from the 1.5-inch line, the Strike Force figures and vehicles. If you'll take a look at that figure, you can see it's identical in its pose to this. They actually sculpted these in full scale with the rest of the line, and they're pretty detailed. It's kind of hard to tell on camera, but they're slightly less detailed than the normal scale figures. And then they just sized this down using mold shrinking until it was the right size. But this is definitely my favorite one, just because it's crazy to me that they had all these other characters. But yeah, it's technically they did release this figure, but they didn't release it in this size.
Yeah, it's very true. One of these days, like I said, I'm going to show off my collection, and part of that collection includes that Brunt, because I also have the mold for that Brunt, which is the coolest thing. And I've also got the Torres from that same line as well that they used for the Maquis Raider. So I've really got to get on my butt and show these things off at some point. But yeah, it's so cool because like I just talked to actually Jeffrey Combs at an event, and I was like, "Hey, I've got your figure." And he's like, "Oh, which one?" I was like, "Oh, the one that didn't get produced." And he was like, "Oh, well, like most of these guys didn't even realize there actually are full size versions of these little mini figures out there." And it's crazy because, like you said, Scott, there is a ton of really amazing detail in them, and it's a shame that like a character like Brunt didn't get a full on release.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, I know we talk a lot about what got missed from the line and where the holes were. Obviously there's a whole community of customizers, which I'm very much a part of, that we spend our time making figures of the figures they didn't make. But if you look at that Strike Force line, I had a list somewhere. I thought I had it right offhand, but they made a ton of characters in that list. There's 3, 4, roughly about 12 different ones, if you would include the couple of generic Klingon warriors that they made and a few generic Borg drones they made. But yeah, Brunt was one of them. Damon Bach is another. Steve Varner shows that in one of his videos, and it's exactly the same. It's same scale. It's just, was sized down. They made Jason Vigo, which is kind of a random character choice. Kales was another one that they had done. Pell and Latek were both there. Quark and Klingon attire, which, I mean, that probably would have been
amazing
used parts, but we'll count it. Valkyris they also made, and then Kempak, the Chancellor, which was sitting in a like throne, so not too sure if that would have been a figure or just a lump of plastic. And then, of course, the Torres is Maquis that you mentioned.
Trek Untold will return momentarily.
Trek Untold is sponsored by Triple Fiction Productions. Celebrating 15 years in business in 2023, TFP creates 3D printed Star Trek and sci-fi inspired items that fit into any collection. Whether you're a cosplayer who wants a Starfleet phaser, a Bajoran tricorder, or a Klingon dagger, or a toy collector looking for that special accessory or diorama to make your figures truly stand out, Triple Fiction Productions has exactly what you need. And for you figure fanatics, that includes products that are the perfect size for Galoob, Mego, Playmates, and everything in between. All products are 3D printed in the US, with new designs constantly being updated on their website. Repeat customers can sign up for TFP's loyalty program for free, where the more you order, the more discounts you receive. TFP also has a Pay What You Want section, where clearance or misprinted items are available at a discounted price. Best of all, every product can be shipped worldwide. As a special bonus for listeners of this show, Trek Untold has a special discount code just for you. Enter Untold10 at checkout for 10% off of all orders with no minimum purchase required. That's 10% off using Untold10. To see all of their products, head to triple-fictionproductions.net. Or to stay up to date on their newest products, find them on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Triple Fiction Productions, where something is only impossible until it happens.
Have you ever watched a YouTube video and said you wish you could do what they were doing? Whether it's the filming, the production, the editing. Maybe you listen to your favorite podcast and you wondered how they put that show together, how they got that great sound quality, what gear they use, how much does it cost to get started? Or maybe you checked out a video or read a book about one of your favorite entrepreneurs and it made you say, I want to live that life. I want to do what they do. Then check out my podcast, Toys and Tech of the Trade. I'm Rich Butler, and I've been making podcasts for almost 2 decades, speaking with experts across all fields to get to the bottom of the hows and whys of their achievements. Each week, I sit down with these amazing people who have carved their own path in life and share the gadgets, the gear, and the tech that they rely on to create their content, the methods that they use to run their business, and the habits and trends that are part of their daily routine and their way of life. And all of that, of course, gets put together to make them successful. We pull back the curtain on the process to help you understand what these people do differently so that you can draw inspiration and get ideas and be inspired so that you can take action today. This podcast is inspiring, educational, it's enlightening, and most of all, it's a lot of fun. I want you to join me on this journey so that you can use the tools and advice shared in this podcast to level up your business or creative endeavors, giving you all the tips, tactics, and tools so that you can transform what you're doing from a side hustle into a full-time lifestyle where you can collect a paycheck for doing what you love. Check out Toys and Tech of the Trade wherever you listen to podcasts, and check out the RageWorks Network at RageWorksNetwork.com for more info on this podcast and all of the many other great shows that we have on the RageWorks Podcast Network. That's Toys and Tech of the Trade with some assembly required.
Well, let's keep going down this line of minifigures. And James, I want to throw this to you now because we're talking about Inner Space, we're talking about Strike Force. Earlier, you mentioned another line that I'd like you to talk about, but I'd love if we can kind of spend some time talking about what didn't get made from Inner Space and from Strike Force, and also that Chromium line that you've shown on your website, as well as I was just looking through the site again last week, and I don't know how I missed this before, but there's going to be more play sets. There's going to be an Enterprise play set that was like going to join. Hey, I'll let you talk about it. You tell us, James. It's really cool. I'm like gushing over this thing.
What you're describing is the Space Tech series of play sets that were sadly unproduced and would have been a part of the Inner Space line. So these 4 play sets would have been environments that would have been compatible with the very small Inner Space Playmates figures, and they would have been interconnected. They would have been modular, so you could connect them to each other. The environments would have been the holodeck, the battle bridge and torpedo bay, the main engineering and the reactor core, as well as the shuttle bay. Now, the interesting thing about the shuttle bay is that it would have been in scale with the existing Inner Space shuttlecraft Goddard. So that will give you some idea of just how large this was going to, this playset would have been when it was connected. So yeah, all 4 playsets, all 4 environments would have connected together to each other to form a cutaway of the Enterprise D, a rather impressionistic one at that, but still very, very cool. And yeah, just very sadly, another one of those Playmates products that we never got to see.
The Chromium line is a little bit like chasing a ghost almost.
A good way to put it.
The idea was they were going to be very similar to the pewter figures that were released in the 90s that had it was a pewter figure with a background, and they really ended up being about that big. But these were sculpted by Henze, and they had a background. The next gen regulars, I think, were all represented, and a Borg drone. And unfortunately, the photos that I've found are all so low res. I've actually put a couple of them into an AI to try and upscale them, and they still look pretty poor. In terms of the Strike Force stuff, I think it's almost like a Playmates really tried this twice, right? Because there's Inner Space and Strike Force, and it felt as though that was really a product of them being caught between the tension of, are they for collectors or are they for kids, right? And I can really remember them. We didn't get any of the Strike Force here in Australia, for the record, but I can remember being quite confused by them and sort of thinking, like, at the same time as the Warp Factor figures are coming out, and they're making some different decisions in relation to the sculpt. So Leda, the Darbo Girl, and the Borg Queen, they're losing some articulation to give us more realistic sculpts. But then there's these toyetic Strike Force ships and playsets that are coming out that really look like they're for a different market. So they were pretty confusing, I think. They were a pretty confusing product. And it's not surprising that they didn't really catch on in the way that the 4.5-inch figures really always did with the collectors. The 4.5-inch figures really were, I think, the favorite. I think probably still to this day of anyone who likes the Playmates line. Were you a fan of the Strike Force, the smaller, the tiny figures?
I was a big fan of the Strike Force and the Interspace. Like, I can clearly remember a milestone event for me as a little kid. My parents gifting me the Interspace Enterprise set, and that's like still one of the coolest toys to this day. I think that's such an underrated line that you can still get again for fairly cheap. But I mean, they had really, really cool play sets that were like one part play set of, whatever interior of a ship. Then also it's like, here's a phaser, here's a tricorder, and it's just like so fun to run around with these things.
I can tell you that because I think Strike Force and Interspace are really quite similar, but I feel like maybe the Strike Force, they went for a little bit more accuracy, and that's further along the line. I'm definitely a fan of that Marquis Raider, because that's really the only Playmates iteration of that ship, and you've got the little Chakotay and B'Elanna that you mentioned inside. And I loved the point at which the ships came with display stands, because then it was, you could really sort of make them look, quite cool. And they look like collectibles. The sculpts were nice enough. It's also an interesting kind of period of where we are in toys in that time period, because, we're looking at, let's say, something like the Interspace series. And that's basically Playmates saying we need to compete with Mighty Max and Polly Pocket. Mighty Max and Polly Pocket. Of course. Yeah, exactly. It looked a little bit like they were chasing a trend, which I suppose probably not for the first time in the line. I think the metallic toys, the metallic figures are an example. Certainly the battle damaged Enterprise D. These were definitely prevalent 90s toy trends that Playmates were chasing, and rightly so, I suppose. It's I know sometimes when we in fan communities talk about the things that we wanted Playmates to do, we forget that there's always a business concern. There's always what will sell, which is probably why you don't have a Galore class electronic Cardassian ship, right? Because who is the general public gonna go for that? Are they gonna recognize that on the shelves of Toys R Us? Maybe not. I mean, I'm personally still annoyed to this day that we never got a full-on phaser rifle like was teased, because that would have been amazing, right? Well, that I can tell you that I definitely remember that from my site, and that had some sort of targeting game attached to it as well, where you've got a cardboard cutout of the Borg drone, and you're shooting them down. So not only is it toyetic, but it's also a full size, as much as you can be. It's a full size Type 3 next gen phaser, which would have been so cool, for cosplayers and kids alike. I think it would have been a big hit. No, I'd love that today. I mean, come on. Yeah. And Scott, since you were showing us part of your 12-inch con here, can you kind of elucidate for us a little bit more on some 12-inch stuff from the world of Star Trek? And I don't know if you know much about this, but I'm hoping you do. Are you familiar with the Ultra Trek and the Latinum Edition series?
I am. And I think this kind of speaks to, what James was saying earlier, where as we got closer to the end of the line, there really were a number of projects in play that sort of speak to, were they trying to do something for collectors? Are we doing toys? They're really for kids? Is there a line there? And as they got close to that, that's where the Latinum edition and a lot of the closing lines started to go off track. And the Latinum edition stuff probably would have been popular with collectors, but I think those toys would probably have been better served to just be released on regular packaging. There was some cool choices like Kirk in the, sleeveless Beer Universe look that I think would have been great as a regular 4.5 figure. I don't know if a diorama in a high price point, which is what they were intended to be sold for, would have made a lot of sense. I think they probably had exhausted some of their goodwill with collectors at that point. The 1701 issue that I don't think there's a Playmates collector that hasn't given their opinion on that. And then of course we got the 6-inch figures. I love the 6-inch figures. But if I had to trade that entire assortment for more 4.5 or earlier, first contact uniform figures and pieces like that, I would certainly have no 6-inch figures and be totally fine. And I think we probably all would feel that way if we had to make a trade. But 12-inch wise, the 12-inch line I think was going really well at first. they're easily the strongest sculpts they did. They're all really nice looking, and the clothing is also a lot better than the 9-inch clothes figures. But they also started releasing a lot of characters that I don't know that people were that excited about, and we got them for Insurrection, and the Insurrection line did not do well. And I think partially that movie was not as well received, but also we were getting releases of characters who were only in that movie, and by that point they had to make some concessions, and you didn't get some of the figures that were supposed to come out in the 12-inch, like Khan, which, I mean, Khan is one of the most iconic characters in Star Trek history. It seems like that's a no-brainer to me. But yeah, there's definitely some plans there that just didn't come to fruition.
I know we're only like halfway into this interview here, but I feel like this is a perfect time for this question, which is kind of about the death of Playmates Star Trek. Really, what do you think were the main causes? This is for both you guys to answer here. I mean, was it the illusion of exclusivity and all the limited editions that killed Playmates? Was it them overextending themselves? What do you think was really the final nail in the coffin that just caused Star Trek to be it for quite some time over at Playmates?
There's some dichotomy there, yeah. I mean, there's definitely some dichotomy. I mean, I'm sure we'll probably have fairly similar answers, but I think piggybacking off of what I said a couple moments ago, there were some areas they were getting into that didn't really feel like they were serving collectors as well as they would like to be, and that meant a lot of resources were being played to certain dead end scenarios in terms of the line, and I think that probably hurt from an internal standpoint, because if you spent a ton of time tooling cadet figures, or even Strike Force and Interspace, they were really cool, but they didn't sell very well, which meant that you were making these very specifically toyetic pieces that would be really appealing to kids, but collectors probably would rather have dioramas and small play sets and more completist version of the 4.5 line. So I think that probably hurt. And then from the collector side of things, I know for me personally, there was a point at which there were just so many coming out that I wasn't going to apply all this money to them. So I had to start making choices, and then that starts breaking you away from, spending as much, because at some point do I care as much about Voyager characters as I do about cadet figures, or which ones do I want and which ones do I not want? And then eventually you start to lose interest, especially if they do things where the exclusivity makes it challenging to actually find the stuff.
It's interesting that you mentioned Insurrection, because that's actually one of my personal fan theories, that movie in that period is really the pivot point for the entirety of the 90s Bowman era Trek, right? And I think the same can be said for the toy line, the action figures. And I remember reading that there were going to be no 4.5 inch action figures for that film, and I couldn't understand that decision. I suppose, again, like in Australia, the exclusivity problem really wasn't an issue, because whatever we could find is amazing. And the 1701 figures meant nothing to us. We didn't know we had no idea any of that was happening. But I do remember around about Insurrection, this was when they were getting into their warp factor figures. They seemed spread really thin, like Scott is saying, that there was this understanding of there's the 4.5 inch, but there's Strike Force and there's ships and there's role play. As a collector, I really wanted them to focus more on those 4.5 inch figures, and the warp factor figures some of them are really, really lovely. And I just wish those waves had been a little bit bigger. Usually they're about 4 or 5 figures a piece. They were going in a direction that I really enjoyed aesthetically with the sculpts. I know not everybody feels similarly, but I liked the more adult look to them. I remember being blown away by Leader and Ilea, the Ilea probe as well, and just those sculpts looked so adult and collectorish. But at the same time, I think as well, the action figure world was really changing, and I think it's tricky to imagine those warp factor figures on the toy shelves or in collector stores at the same time as McFarlane Movie Maniacs, that just looked mind-blowing, and Playmates really, I mean, it's interesting. It mirrors the real life, tribulations that were going on with the show itself, in that there was this mentality, there was this 90s mentality to the toys, and maybe also the show, as the landscape was changing as well, and collectors were really asking for more. And I think I had the Movie Maniacs at T1000 and it came with like an alternate torso, and it blew my mind. And they were in Australia, they were the exact same price point, right? So for the same money, you're getting these very different products. I think that was definitely part of the death of the line. The Ultra Trek figures, I realize, they're a bit gimmicky. They're on this sort of on this background, but I think they still hold up. They still look really wonderful. And I think that, so I guess I was the right age to have grown up, and I would have grown up with those Ultra Trek figures where I'm ready to maybe put away my, my caricaturish Worf and the Ferengi with the whip, and I probably would have really appreciated the display piece of the Borg Queen or the 7 of 9 in the brown outfit, which I would have loved that. It would have been amazing.
Hey everybody, we'll get right back to the interview in 1 second, but I wanted to remind you all to check out Trek Untold over at Patreon. Patreon is the best way to directly support creators of things you like through a monthly subscription of an amount that you can choose. Trek Untold has a few different tiers already with different benefits, ranging from early access to episodes, the ability to ask a future guest questions, exclusive merchandise, and other bonuses that I'd love to offer, but first I need to grow that Patreon community to do that. Trek Untold has been around since mid-2020 and has grown a ton since then, thanks to listeners and viewers like you. Through a platform like Patreon, you can help me keep improving the quality of each episode and keep bringing you new interviews with folks that make the Star Trek universe what it is. If this community can grow more over on Patreon, I can offer new perks like watch parties, exclusive Trek Untold episodes, being able to directly interact with guests, and other things, but in order to do that, I need to know my audience wants these things. The best way to tell me what you want is by supporting us on Patreon, so please, check us out at patreon.com/TrekUntold today and become a bigger part of the Trek Untold family. And now, back to the interview. All right, so Scott, James, I think between the three of us here, maybe we could try to solve a little bit of a mystery in Star Trek toys here. I want to talk about the mystery of naked Data from First Contact. And I think we've all seen the photos of it. They're mildly disturbing, but we've all seen the photos of it. And for folks who don't know what we're talking about here, in Star Trek First Contact, they were making their toy line, of course, with Playmates. And there's a toy that was sort of shown, sort of not shown, that was basically meant to be like Data, but part of his skin is ripped off. You can see a lot of his exposed android body, and he's essentially naked with all this happening too. So there's a lot to unpack with this, and there's a lot of rumor and innuendo about it. I'd love to see if we can really decode it and kind of figure out what's fact, what's fiction. Thank you, Jonathan Frakes. So I'll throw this out there to the panel right now. Gentlemen, naked Data, real or not?
Well, I've been calling him skinless Data, and
fat-free Data.
Yeah. And not to again, spruik our documentary, but he's going to be in our next episode. And the research that I did was very scant, but the two reasons obviously was his obvious inaccuracy to anything that appeared on screen, but also an idea that he would be too scary for kids. That they had come up with something rather ghoulish. And if you look at the sculpt, it's intense. He's fully, he's nude, and he looks like a Terminator.
Yeah, I think it's probably just a product of the time. They were receiving probably pretty scant details on what they needed to produce. And, you had a scene where Data has skin removed and and some things happen, I don't want to spoil it for, all the people who haven't seen this 20-plus-year-old movie. But no, I mean, he obviously has skin removed in it, and they probably got some details around that and started working up some concept that they thought might fit. But ultimately, like some other moments in the line, they the movie's about to come out, and I mean, it was a gruesome looking figure, and where it fit, there wasn't as many adult figures. I think that was probably just a little bit before you started seeing some of the McFarlane stuff. That definitely was more gruesome and more adult. And for Trek, that really didn't make as much sense. So it's probably some confluence of those items.
There's also the mystery of diagnostic data as well, who was slated for the 4.5-inch line in Wave 2. And information's really scant. Again, this is the archaeology of of learning about the Playmates line. But the images used in the magazine press was an image of Data with his sort of side head panel removed. And Jim Garber at the time, who was the head of the Playmates line, said that they just couldn't make it work in terms of sculpt that they liked, that they were happy enough with, and that they would get back to it later on, which I guess ultimately never really happened. So who knows what that figure could have looked like.
Now, to be clear, too, I was actually checking out the Up Close and Plastic blog, and I found a photo of what it was, I think, a Toy Fair display. I don't know if this is the same Data that you're talking about or a different one, but there is one that's basically in a red command uniform with half its face stripped away. Is that the diagnostic Data?
No, oddly enough, that is a prototype for one of the Ultra Treks. It's a really, really bizarre prototype in that it looks as though it's like one of the First Contact 6-inch figures with all the articulation in place, but he's got the red command top half of his uniform. That's from a collector, actually, who has a bunch of Ultra Trek photos from that time. And I think, to my recollection, those are just test shots. So who knows? But I mean, things like the Next Generation Transporter series got through with huge inaccuracies. So that may well have come out as is.
All right, well, gentlemen, let's get a little bit personal about our collections now, because I'm very curious to hear your answers on this, because you guys got some cool stuff. I can see all the wonderful stuff that James has back there. I think I see a Redemption Data hiding over there.
Oh, yeah.
Making me jealous.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Yeah, that one I did not have yet.
I take them all out of the packet, irrespective of how much they cost, because they are mine and they are my toys, and it is their genetic destiny to end up, being played with and handled by me. So, this is a favorite of mine, actually. This is even though in terms of rarity, he's not the rarest, but definitely one of my favorites.
Well, let's go through that right now, actually, for James and Scott. And I'll start with you, James, since we already saw a little bit of yours. But let's say, what would be your guys, if you had to pick, like, your top favorite Playmate Star Trek figure, and then also the worst one you have in your collection, or the worst one that you won't pick up? Because I know, Scott, you're not a completionist, right? So what's like the worst one that you just absolutely loathe whenever you see it in a toy store or something?
In terms of favorites, I think it's cheating a little bit, but Deep Space Nine Wave 1, the entire wave, is the perfect compromise between toyetic, caricaturish toys, but at the same time, they've gone for a more neutral approach with the sculpts. It didn't hurt that DS9 is my favorite show. I was really into it when I was a kid. I was the right age for those toys. And they did all the regulars in their sort of season 1 and 2 looks. I love Quark from that wave so much, but I can tell you that Julian Bashir was, in sort of Australian 1990s money, this was the most expensive thing I bought as a kid. This was $50. Just because we didn't get these figures. we did get some. I have an interesting thing to show you, actually. We did get some strange figures here. We got these Australian exclusives, which I've since found out that they are sought after by international collectors. They've got O'Brien, Jadzia, and Julian in the duty uniforms on the card as well. And to anyone seeking these things, I hate to say, these things were everywhere. They were $2 or $3 at the end of their life, and we hated them with a passion here because they were clogging up the toy aisles. But yeah, DS9 was my favorite wave. In terms of the ones that I like the least, look, I've just photographed every single Playmates figure for this YouTube documentary, and I can tell you that the ones that irritate me are the ones that will not stand. independently, on their own, or they've made some really weird decisions with the sculpt and decided to, all respect to the sculptors, because, by and large, I'm a fan of their work. Trelane, trying to get that guy to stand. Yeah, that was a real challenge. And oddly enough, the Admiral Kirk and the Spock from the classic movie series, they've got those strange poses where they're on one foot, really, and just trying to get them to stand in a photograph. Yeah, I know a lot of people don't like the salt and pepper shaker figures like Data and Picard as a Romulan and stuff. I like those guys. I just want them to stand up. That's all. Just stand up. That's of an action figure. If you want an action figure to do anything, it's just stand up on your own, right?
Yeah, see, for me, I feel like you mentioned earlier you were cool with Lita, but I think Lita is one of the worst ones for me, unfortunately. And I do think when I did my Trek Back Tuesday series on Nerd News Today, we reviewed a lot of figures. And the one that both of us agreed was probably the worst one we ever reviewed so far was the Edith Keeler figure. Because that one just was, it was cool more or less to look at, but it's just like, can barely move. Accessories are just like silly beyond silly. It's not really a great one. Personally, I'm also not really a fan of the Nausicaan that much. But, I can go on about that.
I remember you asking Steve Varner about Edith Keeler, actually.
Yeah, that's a bizarre one.
Yeah. It's a big move. Yeah.
I have to ask why you don't like the Nausicaan figure.
I just don't think I ever really liked the design that much either, even just seeing it on screen. So for me, the toy, it just seems just like this bizarre hog character. Like it feels more like, if you guys have ever seen the Swamp Thing film, where at the end of the film, like this little dude is like a little pig monster running around. It reminds me of that, and I hated that. But it's that on steroids all of a sudden, and it's just more and more disturbing. There's another one that's similar to it that I'm blanking on right now, but there's just like two that are fairly close together that look like that. They just don't do it for me. I don't know why, really, beyond that.
It's over.
Is it
Yeah, I was going to say it's over your shoulder.
Yep. That's the one.
Yeah.
This guy, he's great. He's great. He and it's the reused Morn costume too from the show, but he's fantastic. He's so extreme, and he's one of the, when Star Trek does really insane, colorful, just gonzo aliens. But I'm with you on the Nausicaan. He's like a discount Predator, right?
That's the best way I'd put it. Yeah, or even worse, I would say the Hunter of Tosk, but that one at least has some interesting merits here and there. It's not cool as a character on TV, just as a toy, never really did much for me. But Scott, how about you? Best, favorite, and worst one that you just want to throw out into space?
So I definitely love, man, there's so many that I love figure wise, but if I had to single it out as one that I both love the sculpt and I love how it looks, it poses well, it's the Worf 6-inch figure. Because it looks exactly like him. The body is good. He's taller. He's, he feels like Worf. I've done a bunch of custom figures with that, like where he's in a spacesuit or, on other bodies, because it's a really great head sculpt. But I really love all the DS9 figures. I love Spock from Unification. I think that's a really fun figure. Figures I don't like. I don't really like the figures that are random one episode, like Riker as a Malkorian. I think is probably the worst figure in in all of the line. That's a throw. I don't want to say throwaway episode, because to me there is no throwaway episodes almost of any Star Trek series. I love them all almost. There's a few super cringe ones, and at least one that is very questionable from a social standpoint that I'm not going to mention from the first season. But there's no reason for Riker as a Malkorian. That episode is not super memorable. It just feels like they needed a reason for a main character to be in that release. But I'd say that I also agree with figures that don't stand up well. That drives me nuts. The Keiko figure is bananas. I have no idea why she's posed in that way. It looks like she's jumping out for a surprise party, and her legs are oddly wide and set too far back. She falls down all the time, and it drives me nuts.
All right, well, in that case, then who's worse, Keiko or I was going to say Superintendent Chalmers, but Intendant Kira.
Oof, that's hard.
Right?
I think
they're both terrible.
You know what? I'll say this. Intendant Kira is bad because she has no articulation, so it's difficult to get the balance. Keiko has no excuse. She has tons of articulation like any of the other figures, so realistically she should stand fine, but they just did not balance it out at all. And I also don't know why she's not more neutral. It's not like Keiko spent a lot of time in active missions and and doing a lot of jumping around. I don't think she needs to be that dynamic.
I love it. Keiko comes with a phaser.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Such a great accessory.
Battle Keiko.
If you look at the card back for Jake Sisko, he's posed with a dagger for whatever reason. It's so great. I was going to say, Scott, I think the Riker as a Malkorian is from that wave 3 of TNG, and my personal theory is that they were trying to imitate the Turtles line where they had done all the regulars and they ran out of ideas, and so here's Raphael in a spacesuit, and here's Donatello as a baseball player, and they were trying to do the same thing with Next Generation, where if you look at that wave, it's Picard and Data as a Romulan, it's Geordi as a Tarchanan alien, it's a Riker as a Malkorian, it's someone in some other disguise, and it's just another way to try and sell you, this another Riker figure, the same character again, really.
Oh yeah, that was a big time 90s trend. I mean, Batman waves had 3 or 4 Batman costumes he would never wear. Spider-Man, always the same. I mean, if the hero characters can be inserted in there to kind of fill out the gaps, but it's always kind of unfortunate because you think about characters that were around at the time that would have been great as figures, and instead we have Riker as a Malkorian.
Well, I do have to agree with you, Scott, on some of the stuff you said that are among your favorites, because I'm also a fan of like the 6-inch figures. Like, I think the head sculpts are better for the most part. I was never really a big fan of like the 9-inch and the 12-inch dolls, just because like I do agree that their head sculpts were excellent, but I just couldn't really get into the doll look of them as much. And mind you, like I am somebody that collects 12-inch figures, and I like that sort of thing, but I never really liked it with the Star Trek stuff. And I will say as well, James, like the DS9 series, like that's, I have not a ton of stuff on display where I live, but the DS9 Series 1 is what's on display, all of them. So yeah, that's like top tier for me. But I think if I had to choose my favorite, it's actually one I don't think you liked as much as you mentioned it, but like the movie series that they did, which had the motion picture version of Kirk and Sulu. It had Krug, it had Savick. To me, like that's one of the best lines that they came out with, because I think the head sculpts are just phenomenal on that. They're all fairly unique bodies. The accessories are very unique to what they were. I feel like that's one of like the strongest waves out there, and probably one of the more underrated ones also.
I'd agree with you on all points. I would say that from that wave, the aliens are the clear winners. And of that wave, Savick and Khan are just, they're some of the best in the entire wave. The sculpts are incredible. Krug, General Chang, there's a General Chang variant with, his hands painted flesh tone that I still don't have. But they're all amazing figures. I wish they'd done some more neutral poses with the Starfleet crew. I did, however, get George Takei to sign my trading card that had come with his Sulu figure from that wave. So it does have some personal value to me. Absolutely.
Very nice. So I'll throw this one out to you guys as well. Whoever wants to go first, feel free to. But I feel like that wave is fairly underrated in a lot of ways. What do you guys think is one of the more underrated figures that you really like, but maybe a lot of other people don't as much?
All right, I'll jump in real quick, and I'm going to say the Telosian, mostly because I love the cage. I love those aliens, and yes, it is a salt and pepper shaker figure. It does sort of just stand there, but the sort of pearlescent finish on it, the head sculpt is perfect. The accessories, I mean, what are you going to give it to Telosian, really? But they're well thought out. The little monitor with Captain Pike. It exemplifies to me the love that was put into the line in the amount of thought on the part of the sculptors. So, yes, I've always championed the Telosian figure.
That's a good one. It kind of reminds me also a little bit of like, I'm just thinking of the 2-pack with Baylock and his puppet.
Yes.
And that's a great one too, right? Yeah. I just kind of reminded me of that, just thinking big-headed aliens. But Scott, how about you? Like most underrated one of your collection?
I really like the Sarek figure. I think the likeness is great. I think the detail is really nice. He's got jewelry. He's got different tones of gray in his hair, which is not something that they always did. He's in robes, so he can't really do much, but he's got the cool live long and prosper hand, and he just looks interesting. And while he only made a couple, yeah, exactly. It's just a really nice looking figure. And it's also one of those callbacks that connects TOS to TNG, which, I love that as a kid. I always thought that was really cool.
So we talked about stuff that's been unproduced. We talked about stuff that we all own in our collections, but what about the things that we never got? So for each of you guys, what is maybe some characters that you wish we had? And this could be even if they were protoed or not prototyped. What are some characters you wish you had in your collection that never saw the light of day? I'm going to start with you, James, in this one.
So rumors persisted, and I've seen this written down a bunch of places, that at the time of the Lions cancellation, that there was going to be number 1 and Commander Shelby, and those are those two. I would have loved both of those two figures. Amazing characters from really iconic episodes, and like you're saying, Scott, it's you think we got Starfleet Academy figures and we didn't get Shelby or number 1. That's I would have loved those two figures, especially another Majel Barrett as well, because that Playmates they had done already 2 likenesses of Majel, and they would have nailed the likeness.
There are a ton. And when I started customizing, I made a list, and that first list was like 140 figures. And so
a little list, that's all.
A little bit of a high order, but at this point I've done 100. So I've gone through a lot of that list. There are a big holes in the Deep Space Nine stuff. It's crazy to me that we never got a Kai Wynn figure. It's crazy to me that they never did the female changeling. They didn't really hit any of the stuff during the Dominion War, which was a huge part of both the closing of Next Gen, and then obviously a ton of Deep Space Nine. So there's just some characters that it's wild to me that didn't get figures. Kai Wynn is probably one of the biggest, because it's just like she was a huge villain, and there's just not even anything close to that. I mean, we got hero boyfriends and lots of other figures that I couldn't really care that much about, even though I'm glad they made them. But it also meant that I had a long list to work with, and I went back and I made Kai Wynn, and Commander Shelby, you mentioned, I made Commander Shelby, and lots of the figures that they didn't get. I would have loved to have had something with Nog's progress from a cadet to an officer. I feel like that was a very popular character, and it would have been cool to see him actually get a full-sized figure with articulation in a Starfleet uniform. But my love tends to lean towards Deep Space Nine, because I feel like after that first couple of waves, we really didn't get much else after that.
So, show of hands right now, who among us is collecting the new Playmate Star Trek toys? And I'm putting mine up there, and I'm seeing neither from either of you guys. Oh my goodness, just me. Okay, yeah, what's up with this, James? What's up?
Yeah, I dabbled. I think at 1 or 2. I see what they're trying to do, but I think I probably would have preferred if they just straight up reissued the 90s figures, really. And I think especially in Australia, the first 2 waves were really overproduced, and you can still find them here for about $10 or $15. And there's a strange, I've heard from a lot of collectors who've said that why do these new figures exist when I can still get that 90s Picard or Riker or Data mint on card, unpunched, for $10 or $20. I think that's maybe a factor, and maybe they haven't sold as well. Certainly that's the case here. They're really not on toy shelves at all here, to tell you. I mean, they're not in the retail toy shop. You can certainly find them online. I think the thing that I loved about the original Playmates toys was the screen accuracy, and the head sculpts were always They were caricaturish, but you could always, from across the room, identify who that character is. You're like, that's definitely Admiral Kirk, or Kira, or whoever it is, even if it was a bit cartoonish. But, I suppose now there's a bit of a dilemma in terms of like, if you don't buy these things, there won't be any more. And so I really hope the line is successful. I have seen blurry images of 7 of 9 coming out, which, that would be great to see. How about you, Scott? What's your take?
I feel pretty similarly to you in that I really questioned what the point would be of doing another Playmates line if they're meant to be sort of vintage inspired, because there isn't really a single figure, even with variants and rarities, that you can buy the figure they gave out at First Contact that was limited to like 100 Borg figures for $500. And if you look at that with, comparisons to other 1990s toy lines that are highly collectible, it's not even close. Like, there's not really anything that's expensive. One of the reasons it's so fun to customize is that it's a very low entry point. If I decide I want to do a character and I need parts, I can probably get something for a couple of bucks if it's common. And so it seemed to me that if they were going to do it, either one, let's reissue figures, or let's use existing parts from the 90s line and come up with some new things. I understand part of it is introducing some of the newer Trek shows in a collector standpoint. And, I grabbed the Discovery figures, and I probably will get the Strange New Worlds figures, but the Picard and Data and Riker are not good enough looking figures for me to go back and grab. They're not super impressive. They're out of scale with what I already have. And so then they kind of exist on their own. So I think from a marketing standpoint, I'm not sure that I really understand what they were going for, because it's not a good nostalgia play and it's not that great of a new product play. So it kind of exists in the middle of those two things. And I don't really know what the idea was there. It seems to me like it would make more sense to do them direct retail, maybe do crowdfunding type things for things that hardcore collectors are really going to get excited about.
Yeah, I have to say, I reviewed them a while back when they first came out, and they were kind of hit or miss for me. They were kind of like so-so. They weren't really like that amazing, but I did want to support the line. I want more. But the problem has also been, I think, as a collector, it's now been like almost a year, and we're still waiting for news. Like you mentioned, James, like, we've seen some leaked blurry pictures from a licensing expo, but we've heard nothing yet. And as of now, we should add that we're doing this interview right now in early September. New York Toy Fair is about a month or so away. I'll be there. So hopefully by then I will have some photos to show, which, if they're really not showing like Strange New World, if they're not showing their Voyager line, if they're not showing any more TNG guys or TOS folks, I don't really know what they're doing with this line. And we do know stuff is coming, but it's just been, I want to call it a trickle, but it's not even a trickle. This is like just nothing. It's a drought is what we have here. And it's so bizarre when you have the guys who made Star Trek toys as big as they were in the 90s now just doing nothing with it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the other factor is as well, when we're looking at the Star Trek Playmates line, is that you're not just looking at a toy line on its merits. It really is connected to the 90s zeitgeist, where Star Trek was as popular as it's ever been, really. And Star Trek's never been Star Wars in terms of its ability to sell merchandise and toys. And I think that most fans accept that. And so the success of the Playmates line is really predicated on that 90s zeitgeist. And a lot of the fans who still collect are attracted to that nostalgia. And if you think about it, look, this was an action figure line that can support Ambassador Sarek or Luoxana Troi, which is crazy now, because if we look at the McFarlane line from a few years ago, they struggled to sell Picard and Kirk, who are, these two icons of the Star Trek pantheon. And so I think that maybe the culture has shifted. I think maybe, Star Trek collectors are a bit spoiled by the Playmates line too, because we got Intendant Kira and all these obscure characters. And there's an expectation that that's going to happen again, without understanding that the production of those figures was really intrinsically linked to the popularity of those 90s Trek shows and its cultural prominence, you know, and as popular as Star Trek can get now with the new wave of shows, you know, it's never going to be 1994 again, right? Like we're never going to get to that place again. You know, I will say though, as a caveat, the Playmates figures, the Prodigy ones really are head and shoulders above the other ones in terms of paint, sculpt, articulation, nice tight joints. It's such a shame what's happened to that show, and I only hope you know, we get to see. That's my pick of the new Star Trek shows personally, and I hope we get to see season 2. I'd love it.
Yeah, the way you're kind of describing how the 90s Star Trek figures were and how they were able to hit all those obscure characters, I feel like today the only thing I can think of that is comparable to that would be Mattel's WWE line. And I think that's kind of a weird thing to say, but I mean, like, they've done like obscure characters. They've done a figure of a guy named the Goon, who was a hockey playing wrestler. They've done like all sorts of things like that, where it's like real one-off characters that mean nothing to anything, but they're able to do that because they've been around so long. They've got just such an expansive line. And yeah, it's true. Like, really no one has hit that kind of mark to this day besides that. It's the closest I can think of. I mean, Scott, do you feel differently?
No, actually, I just have a thing to add on to the end of that. I think part of the reason they can get away with it is that coming out of the 90s, there wasn't any completist level of things. You know, the Hasbro WWF line really was only around for a few years. Most of the waves are pretty small. You know, they don't have a ton of figures, and they sometimes made random things they thought kids would like, but that weren't super important to, you know, the kids who were actually watching wrestling. So maybe they didn't care about Skinner and, you know, Jim Neidhart in the high energy gear. And, you know, there just wasn't that many figures that they were out for 5 years essentially. And I think they basically crossed the 70 figures mark, you know, which is not very many. And I think that also was reflected in WCW figures from the time and really any of the figure lines. So now, years and years later, you know, if you have nostalgia for wrestling, you will buy Goon and Gobbledygooker and all these random characters because you never would have got them as a kid. So now your line in all of the characters you ever wanted are available. I don't think there's almost anyone who doesn't get a figure these days. And many of them, it's like, you know, someone just got signed and their figure comes out 5 months later.
There was a period in time with the 90s Trek shows where that was happening, where you'd see an episode. And I remember for the first time seeing a couple of episodes. I remember notoriously seeing Threshold and thinking to myself as a kid, I'm like, I can't wait for that mutated Tom Paris. And of course they made it, you know, and they were really keeping up with the shows, the Cisco as a Klingon. I remember seeing Apocalypse Rising, and then of course, bam, there's the figure, you know. And so those are halcyon days. Those are there was a time when the market could support that, and the popularity of Trek, not only culturally but in terms of sales, is going to support making those characters, just like the wrestling figures. You know, the minute people are signed, they're getting ready for their figure. And I think you can look at the rollout of the DS9 figures and the Voyager figures as a good example, where the DS9 figures came out in season 2 of DS9, and they really dragged their feet. I think the Malibu Comics was the first piece of merchandise that came out for DS9, whereas with Voyager, they were ready to go when Voyager premiered, and those Voyager figures are very season 1 specific, you know, so they were ready to go. And that is just indicative of, again, 1995. You know, Trek is this popular. We're ready to go with figures straight away. We're very, for those of us who've lived through it, sounding old now, but we're so lucky to have had that. And like Scott is saying, you know, the most of the figures, barring maybe a handful of them, unless you want like the Super Nintendo Cisco, they're all out there. They can all be had for reasonable amounts of money, you know, or you can get on eBay and buy lots, you know, and if you're not fussed about them being in their packaging, you know, even better. They'll be even more economical for you.
And I didn't really intend for us to like segue into pro wrestling the way I did, but this actually is a pretty great time for me to throw this at you, Scott, because, you know, we danced around it about an hour ago where you mentioned that you're a pro wrestler here. And I know that a lot of your wrestling these days is a little bit more focused, let's say, in our sort of nerdy interests. So kind of tell us about what you're doing these days in wrestling, and have you done a Star Trek gimmick yet?
No, I will say that it is something that I have asked for a couple of times. I have been wrestling for FSCW, which is Fantasy Super Cosplay Wrestling, and they tour with GalaxyCon, which is one of the more major convention circuits in the US. And we dress up as individual characters, and it's basically that age-old conversation of, oh, who would win in a fight? Is it Superman or Chun-Li? And then we go out there and as professional wrestlers in, durable costumes, we'll go out there and fight each other and decide what those contests should work out like. I have suggested Star Trek here and there. Due to my size, there's some limitations on which characters that I could portray. I think, I've tried to push towards the Klingon area because I think it'd be really fun to be a Klingon. It's a little tough though because I generally portray characters with a lot of makeup already, and Kratos is the primary one that I've been doing, and there's a lot of appreciation for Kratos, so I really can't get away from Kratos. Plus, Kratos does get to win a lot, so it's sort of hard to balance which one I'd rather do. But I would love to do at least a Klingon or some Star Trek alien, maybe push to do Worf. I think Worf could be funny dropped into those situations because he is such an fish out of water character a lot anyway, so it would be very funny in an incredibly crazy world.
I mean, I could definitely see you being like a battle Vulcan or something, just like coming in with like your Kolinar robes and just tearing it open and just being like, yeah, live long and get pinfall victory.
Yeah. You will not be living long.
It writes itself. Come on. Well, Scott, for anybody who wants to follow you, whether it's as a toy collector or as a pro wrestler, how can they do that?
I have an Instagram. It is The Great Scott H. That's usually my more personal stuff, cosplay stuff. Occasionally I throw a little wrestling and traveling on there. I also have an Instagram for wrestling, which is Leon of the Wasteland. That's my normal wrestling character. And then on Twitter, I'm Leon Ravage. And those are probably the two main social environments to follow me on.
And for you, James, how can the Trek Untold audience learn more about what you're doing, stay up to date with all your videos, and more importantly, check out your website?
I'm on Facebook and Twitter. You can find me James Patrik, Patrik. I'm on Twitter most of the time at Playmates Trekker. We'll be posting updates on our new documentary. We have part 1 already out there. So please like and subscribe and check it out, which really helps us and my overlords who are helping me out to make this happen. It is 90s retro Star Trek retro 90s action figures by Playmates. If you put that into YouTube, you will see the video, a nice big thumbnail with Picard. But yes, hit me up on Twitter, as well as episode 2. We're also working on episode 3, which is covering the warp factor years. So incidentally, if anyone out there has some rare images of Toy Fair, prototypes, this is in by and large, this is how we've put this documentary together. So we would very much love you to make contact with us. And incidentally, Scott, as well, thank you so much. Your Nog custom is going to be featured in one of our videos, and it's such great work. So personally, be able to say thank you for letting us use it in our video.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Likewise, you're very welcome.
Cheers.
I like how all three of us kind of tangentially knew each other in some sort of ways, but I feel like this is the first time we're all getting to hang out like this. This is pretty awesome. I'm pretty happy about this.
Well, it's a small community, right? Like, and it's a very niche community, right? It's a very niche thing to be into. Yeah,
but for us to be like this, and especially, I mean, this is just so cool. But you guys, you've already had custom stuff with each other. We've talked all here and there, I think, in various social media places. But this is definitely long overdue, and I feel like we need to have another play date another time soon. So I hope we can do that. So Scott, James, thank you so much for sharing all your expertise today. for talking toys, and just for sharing your collections too. That's some really cool stuff. I love doing things like this. I hope I can do it more in the show. So it's been real fun for me to do this today. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. It's been a great time.
That's it for this week's show. Thanks again for checking out Trek Untold. If you aren't already, please follow Trek Untold on social media, where you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, among others, all at Trek Untold. Don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube for the video versions of this show at youtube.com/@TrekUntold, and subscribe to us on whatever platform you're listening to the audio version on. We always appreciate likes, shares, comments, thumbs up, ratings, and reviews, and whatever you can do to help spread the word about this podcast and inform other Trekkies about why they need to check this show out. If you're able to financially support this show, visit patreon.com/TrekUntold to learn about the different ways you can contribute to keeping this show going full speed ahead. Until next time, I'm Matthew Kaplowitz. This has been Trek Untold, and remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com, promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the RageWorks podcasting network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.